na onim mestima gde vidim da imate odlično rezonovanje, ali da prosto možda to niste trenutno u stanju da izrazite na adekvatan način. I da tu postoje neke sasvim očekivane, by the way, ne rupe u znanju, koliko prosto niste 4. godina, prosto to je to. Niste završili ovaj fakultet, niste završili studije, nemate prosto pregled celog jednog, da kažem, perioda od 2000 godina praktično, gde i mnogo više od toga, gde biste mogli da uopšte imate taj raspon i koncepata i fenomena da biste mogli da date sud o nečemu. To ne znači da ne treba to da radite. Luka uhvatila svoju trupu, rekli ste, čini mi se, ako se dobro sećam. Sad se plašim da opet nešto ne pogrešim. Molim vas, grešite. Mislim, molim vas, delite sa mnom. Znam i drago mi zbog toga, zato vas i ovaj moj tipičan public shaming koji nemam već 2 godine da sa studentima otvoreno pričam o nekim stvarima. Šalim se naravno za ovo public shaming. Prozivka je, jel? Drugim rečima, zato što mi je drago da možemo uopšte o ovome da razgovaramo, da ja, sad iskoristit ću vreme, ali ajde da damo još par minuta da se svi ostali skupe, uvijek ću gledati da pričamo o tim konceptima, fenomenima, društvenim, kulturološkim, jako objektivno, koliko god nam to čudno bilo u nekim trenucima, i da probamo da svi usvojimo jednu istu terminologiju. Zašto je to bitno? Vi ćete se susretati i sa tim izrazom terminologija jako često i imaćete i lingvističku terminologiju i ovu književnu našu, odnosno kritičku, i ko bude nastavio na master i na doktorske studije shvatit će koliko je zapravo terminologija problematično jedno polje u nauci, iz prostog razloga što se kroz vekove ona manje više menjala, a odnosi se na iste stvari, i prosto negde ću probati da vam dam tu neku bazu, da razumete najosnovnije stvari, a da zatim vi kroz vaše studije prosto razvijete jedan osjećaj za kontinuitet i za tradiciju nauke, jer bez terminologije adekvatne i bez poznavanja nekih osnovnih stvari ne možemo da se bavimo naukom. Ni ovom našom humanističkom naukom, odnosno zbirom humanističkih nauka, mi smo takozvana soft science, ali to ne znači da nemamo sistematizovan način na koji posmatramo fenomene. Znate tu razliku među soft i hard sciences?
U principu da, ali opet ne definicijski.
Soft sciences su društvene nauke, uključujući i psihologiju, na primer. Hard sciences su nauke koje se bave prirodnim zakonima, odnosno našom prirodom, mislim prirodom. To su fizika, hemija, biologija čak manje, ona već spada i u soft sciences svojim jednim značajnim delom. Medicina je hard science jer je interdisciplinarna nauka koja sadrži neke postulate iz ovih hard sciences i tako dalje. I sada u čemu je caka, jel? U tim prirodnim naukama mnogo je lakše objasniti zašto je terminologija bitna, zato što ako svi ne koristimo iste brojeve, iste znake za recimo sabiranje, oduzimanje i slično, kako ćemo da razumemo svi na isti način recimo jednu formulu matematičku, jednu jednačinu, na primjer. I u suštini naučnici širom sveta mogu da se sporazumeju kroz te svoje formule matematičke na mnogo lakši način nego što to možemo mi jezicima raznim. I to je u stvari ta terminološka osnova o kojoj ja pričam. Sad, u našim naukama, odnosno u našoj nauci, u ovom slučaju to je jedan sociokulturološki, pa čak i politički pregled nekih mnogih događaja u proteklih 2000 godina, koji se tiču barem jednog, da kažemo, izolovanog uzorka društva, odnosno britanskih ostrava, odnosno Engleske. To je malkice teže zato što to znači da ćemo mi obuhvatiti mnoga naučna polja i mnoge druge nauke. Ali moramo znati neke stvari. So to begin this class by, in a way, revising what we've done last week and the week before, and what you've done last week with Maria as well, because you had a very good introduction into what I'm going to talk to you about today, Christianity, right? So talking about this terminology, these bases and the foundations of how we even, objectively view and discuss things, there has to be a separation, and it's a very important one, between what beliefs are, or sets of beliefs, and what a religion is. Now, I think I mentioned this at one point or another, and please tell me if I have, but a set of beliefs is not necessarily an organized practice, whereas a religion usually has, not usually, always has its own sets of beliefs, but at the same time, these beliefs are systematized, usually in the form of, let's say, a book, like the Quran or the Bible, the Torah for the Jewish community. The Hinduism also has Vedas, if I'm not mistaken, sets and sets of stories about their gods, etc. In these sort of written documents, because they eventually become written documents, even the Book of Mormons, right? Even that is a systematized set of beliefs that is transformed into something that is a very particular religious term, and it's called a dogma. Have you heard about dogmas? I will put it I'll write this word down in the chat. Dogma.
Yes.
Okay, Luka knows. Anyone else? Do you guys know what a dogma is?
Yes.
No, not really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, someone said not really. A dogma is a belief that you're supposed to blind, or not just a belief and a rule that you're supposed to blindly obey. So when something is dogmatic, it's usually not open for discussion, even in terms of whether it's right or wrong, or accurate or inaccurate. A dogma is something that is supposed to remain unchanged forever, as a belief, as an instruction of behavior, as a pattern of something, etc. In Christianity, we have certain dogmas. The Muslims, I suppose, have certain dogmas, the Jewish as well. And usually, as mere followers, as religious people, we don't necessarily know how to recognize a dogma, because we are taught dogmas through our upbringing, right? Through practices, through communal practices and rituals. And therefore, we are not, used to understanding these beliefs or practices or whatever as something that is unquestionable. And yet, we accept them as natural, as unchangeable. Have you noticed things like that in your own, let's say, life, upbringing, etc.? Any such dogma, for example? Yes, Luka.
Well, for example, our parents can sometimes have certain quote-unquote dogmas about how they should bring up children.
Yeah, of course, but I meant religiously. Like,
Oh,
because
really?
most of us, I will assume, in a very generalized way, and not as to offend anyone, so please don't be offended. I don't think that only Christians live in Serbia. I am well aware of the existence of other religious communities, like with Muslims can. I'm sorry, Milice, I don't understand what you... Yes, Milice. That's precisely what I'm saying. So exactly. So the members of the Islamic community don't eat certain foods, the same foods that incidentally the Jewish community doesn't eat. So they basically eat kosher. Okay, kosher. Yes, Dimitria?
So it's like fasting but permanent.
Not really. If you have any Muslim friends or acquaintances, you should ask them, because during their Ramadan, in fact, they fast, yes, as Dimitria said, but at the end of it, they actually, how do I say this? They actually slaughter a ram, ovna, or a sheep, depending on of course, the status, the class, the financial means of the family, and it's supposed to be shared among the community. Yes, Nicolia.
I wanted to mention something because I actually do have some Muslim friends.
Okay.
And I remember actually having this discussion with one of them.
Okay.
They also, any type of meat they eat, not just during Ramadan, but if they're an actual Muslim, they are supposed to practice not eating any type of meat that's not slaughtered in the halal way.
Yes.
The good way. They have a prayer done for the animal, and the animal is always supposed to be killed away from the other animals to honor it, because they are supposed to see life as a gift.
Yes.
Actually, I feel like when it comes to Islam as a whole, people don't. I mean, I don't love the religion, but there are definitely some parts of the religion that are good and have good mentalities that people completely overlook just because of what they think being Muslim is.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning this. In fact, I made not objectively, it's not that big of a mistake, because kosher practices and halal practices are very similar. But kosher is used for the Jewish people. Halal, thank you, Nicolia, is used for the Muslim community, the Islamic community. And yes, what you just said, there are certain beliefs that we would in fact find very humane and very civilized and civilizing, if you will. Koja je razlika kad kažemo civilized and civilizing? It makes us better as humans, right? It makes us more civil, more humane. And there are amazing and beautiful ideas in practically every single religion, right? Depending on the place where it originated, it sort of created this story out of the bits that existed before, and it created a beautiful philosophy. However, as a person who likes to question things, I'd also like to question the beginnings of the Islamic religion, as well as the Jewish one, as well as the Christian one, which is our topic today, to an extent at least. But yeah, you basically got it. There's this, usually with a religion, which means that it's a systematized set of beliefs with established practices, with an institution behind it, there is usually a dogma. Dogmas are not there to be questioned. Dogmas are there to be reproduced, to be repeated over generations and generations and generations of people, and to be obeyed. And that's it. And that can be a problem for some people, or it may not. But usually we respect, when we say we respect tradition, that's basically what we are doing. We are, in a way, respecting a certain dogma. Yes, Natalia.
Well, I think that in religions, dogmas are kind of necessary, because a religion sort of means to have that kind of blind faith in something, and if we start questioning that, then
we don't believe.
It's not really the point of that religion. So the dogma is there to kind of stop us from questioning something that the religion says.
Exactly. And I mean, again, thank you so much. A perfect introduction into the story about Christianity. And but just to regress for a second there. So there is that. I mean, I know Luka is an atheist. Probably some of you also have questions about what you need to believe in and what not. But it's irrelevant.
I'm a Satanist too.
Sorry?
I'm a Satanist too, an atheist and a Satanist.
Okay.
Sorry, I have one question for Luka, please. Are you in the Temple of Satan or Church of Satan or where?
Naravno, Temple of Satan. Mislim, u Selemu, šta god. Mislim, nisam učlanjen ni u šta, samo kao
You follow them.
Odlično
I'm sorry.
ste dotakli ovog, Luka, opet, Dimitrije, morate mi dati ovde sekund jedan. You cannot believe in Satan and say you're an atheist.
Mogu samo da...
Yes. Možete post časa, ali ovo, pošto je ovo terminološki jedan uvod, da kažem, onda ako ćemo naučno i ozbiljno posmatrati bilo koji fenomen, pa i fenomen religije, gnosticizam govori o verovanju, odnosno verovanju u nešto. Zato ga zovu gnosticizam, dakle verujemo u nešto, čak i ako ne znamo tačno šta je to nešto, ko je to entitet. Ali verujete u nešto. Možete da budete gnostik, da verujete u Boga, u boginju, u hrišćanskog Boga, islamskog Boga, jevrejskog Boga i tako dalje. Jahve. Šta god. Možete da budete agnostik, možete da budete ateista, možete da budete teista. I sada, tu ima nekih raznih gradacija. Gnostici u suštini ne priznaju postojanje jednog Boga, više razmišljaju u pogledu postojanja nečega što je iznad nas, nečega, kad kažem iznad nas, mislim toj nekoj percipiranoj hijerarhiji, ontološkom smislu, u smislu šta postoji, a da je moćnije od nas, i tu gnosnici u nešto veruju. Nekad možete da čujete gnostike da kažu verujem u kosmos, ja ću često kažem hvala kosmosu umesto hvala Bogu. Onda imate teiste koji su obično na onim stranama tipa, ne znam, Jevreji, muslimani, hrišćani, hindu i tako dalje. Znači imate taj raspon gde oni veruju u postojanje jednog Boga, najčešće jednog, ili evo recimo Luka u antiheroja Boga, odnosno u Lucifera, čoveka, to je čoveka, entitet imena.
Bih samo posle da objasnim kad...
Posle, molim vas, nema veze, znam da ste vi šalite, ali hoću da kažem, moramo da budemo i ozbiljni ovim nekim stvarima. I imate ovaj prefiks a koji označava ne, agnostik, ateista. I to su vrlo jasne stvari, znači ateista ne veruje u postojanje tog jednog Boga. Recimo ja ne verujem u postojanje hrišćanskog Boga, niti jevrejskog, niti muslimanskog, nemam uopšte tu ideju da može da postoji čovek tako kako je opisan sa belom bradicom, neki Pai Mei u kom god rasnom i etničkom pogledu vi to želite, koji baš na taj način radi stvari kako su opisane u tim svetim knjigama, jer teret dokazivanja postojanja nekog entiteta je uvek na osobi koja kaže da taj neki entitet postoji. Se čuli nekad za taj argument? The argument of proving the existence, usually of God.
Yes.
Yes.
Na primjer, ako kažete vatra gori, zgrada je pod vatrom, u vatri, kako god, morate da to dokažete, inače lažete, je li tako? Ako ima dima, možemo da pretpostavimo da ste negde u pravu, ako ima vatra, ako vidimo plamenove, u pravu ste, ali da mi govorite da nešto gori, a ja to ne vidim, ne samo ja, nego objektivno to ne može da se sagleda, znači da vi niste uspeli da dokažete da je nešto tu. I u suštini ateisti ne moraju da dokazuju postojanje Boga, ali teisti moraju, jer oni tvrde. I to je ono što je Natalija malo pre spomenula sa verom. Vera je izuzetno bitan aspekt u svemu ovome. So faith is extremely important. In order to know something, you have to study it. But in order to believe something, you really don't have to study it. Koliko vas je pročitalo Bibliju? Pošto smo, recimo, većinom ovde hrišćani. Ako ima neko ko nije, slobodno nek se javi. Jes, Nikolija?
Ja sam, bar lično, mene religija dosta zanimala jedno vreme. Pročitala sam novi deo Biblije, i to je naša crkva koju izdaje.
Novi Zavet, dobro.
Da. I pročitala sam jedan deo Kurana.
Dobro.
I uglavnom sam za neke religije nešto malo čitala o njima. I imam osjećaj da dosta ljudi koji kažu da veruju nešto nemaju bazu na što zapravo veruju.
Tako je. Jedno pitanje je to, Nikolija, za vas, na primjer. Sad ne bitno da li ste vi vernik ili ne. So it's basically your position on that is irrelevant. But when you started reading these texts, and this is, by the way, a question for everybody, whether you read it or not, never mind, it's a question for all of you. When you read something, like a holy book, and I say this very intentionally, a holy book is a holy book. Okay, it's not like a textbook that someone's written, because you can say, oh, that person has no idea what they're talking about. A holy book is usually even nationally recognized as like an artifact of culture belonging to a religion. So it's a very, powerful thing, a holy book, or calling something a holy book. So let's take the Bible for our, let's say, most illustrative example. You read the Bible and the New Testament and the Old, and you find parts of it that you cannot possibly relate to because they represent certain positions, beliefs that are shameful, even cruel, barbaric. They explore, or they describe practices that not only are they no longer present in our society, but they should never be practiced again. And then you say, upon reading it, oh, well, it's just part of it, but the rest is okay, or maybe 50% of it, is a bit, arguable, but the rest is fine. I can use it as a holy book. What do you think about that?
I think that's really true. I feel like the whole point of religion ever since it was, I personally don't believe in any of the religion that exists. I feel like religion in its own was, when it was made for that time. And now people that believe in God tend to take things from the Bible or from whatever religion they're in, whatever book they believe in or anything they believe in. If they have a holy script, they take parts of the holy script that abide by what they believe in, and they will believe in what they believe in, and will try to change their beliefs, even if their book tells them the other thing, because they want to feel like they're right. And especially if you're...
So that's basically selective reading and selective and very calculated use of certain things that are in those books. And this is not only the case with Christianity, it's the case with basically every single religion. Because in every single religion, you can find something that is so obsolete that you simply cannot go past that. I mean, just look at the situation in Poland. So in our contemporary moment, in our present moment, the woman was basically killed by incompetent doctors who rejected to do abortion on her fetus, which was killing her for 20 weeks. The fetus was 22 weeks old. Week 8, I think, she knew that it had certain problems, that it cannot develop properly, that it was a very dangerous condition for her as well as the fetus, and they did not allow for abortion to happen because it's against God. But you could go to Jerusalem and kill a bunch of Muslims because it's also something that God loves. Znači, ja obožavam reč bogougodno. Šta je to zapravo bogougodno? Ako se vodimo knjigom koja je pisana negde između pre četvrtog i negde 8., 9., 10. veka, uključujući tonu spisa za koje istorija u zadnjih 200 godina dokazala da ne datiraju iz vremena Hrista, da ne datiraju iz 2., 3., 4., 5., 6. veka, nego tik tamo iz 11., 12., 13., 15. i slično. Znate li ko je to raspon? Kad pogledate recimo novinske članke, when you look at newspaper articles from 70 years ago, 100 years ago, and you see how people reasoned back then. And I'm just talking about Serbia. I'm not even talking about the rest of the world. And you realize, oh my God, how did these people even survive with those opinions, with those, sort of those ideas about the world around us? And then go back 1900 years ago and use the book written by who knows who, and use it as a holy book. So that's very tricky. But this all gets us to the very important thing that I actually corrected Luka about. He was talking about Jesus Christ, who is actually, if we are going to be completely open today, he's one of my favorite early human superheroes. Human because he was a human, but superhero because he got resurrected. And I don't say this as a joke, really. I'm actually saying it because I observe even that part of our culture, as in human culture, as, you know, fiction. He's our first fictional superhero. He basically comes to this community, well, in his own community and to other community, he spreads the amazing ideas about a new kind of living. He spreads this humane philosophy, and then he teaches people something, and then he gets persecuted, and then he dies, he gets tortured, dies, and then resurrects. I mean, it's amazing. He's basically a Superman, but he's a God man. And that's why he's recognized in the religion as the son of God. Ali to je isto jedna mnogo problematična stvar. Inače, koga interesuju te neke sitnice baš u tome, imate knjigu, mislim da imate u kopirnici, imamo preko puta našeg faksa, zove se Srednjovekovna misao o društvu. Ovako izgleda knjiga. I neverovatno je zanimljiva iz prostog razloga što je pisao istoričar i sociolog, koji je jako lepo razbio na činjenice onako, koje će ljudima koje to sve interesuje da budu baš onako prosvetljujuće, na koji je način u stvari stvorena predstava o Hristu, na koji način je funkcionisala religija u srednjem veku. And of course we will be covering some of that here, and you will be covering a lot of it with Professor Daniela and I think Marco in this semester. But anyway, Luka mentioned in the class, talking about Jesus Christ, he mentioned something very peculiar. He said, and I don't remember the whole thing, obviously it was a week ago, but he said that there is a difference between the body and the soul. Now, Luka, I don't remember the exact context in which you started explaining this, and it's irrelevant for now, but there was a mention of the pagans, so peoples with sets of beliefs prior to Christianity, understanding body and soul in a different way. Now, do you see a problem with that? Pitanje za sve. Pitanje za sve. Utite sad, nemojte se branite, ovo nije napad na vas.
Ne, samo ako možete ponovite, nisam
čuo. Moje pitanje je, šta je problematično u tome? What is problematic in my saying that there is a difference in the way pagans before Christianity understood body and soul, and Christians understanding body and soul, early Christians, of course. Is there anything problematic in that sort of comparison or contrast? What do you guys think? Yes, Dimitri.
Are you referring to that they thought that the body should suffer and whatnot?
Who is they?
What? They early Christians. I'm sorry. I should be more specific. So early Christians thought that the body should suffer in order for our soul to move on to heaven. Are you referring to that?
Yeah, I'm referring to even a more basic, elementary sort of thing in that sort of question of mine. Is there a problem with what I ask you? Did pagans really believe in a soul? Did they know what a soul was?
Not really, in my opinion, at least.
I think problem. Znači,
I think. Okay.
Ne, ja ću zato što
okay. Mislim da treba nešto
postavi kao pravilo. So pagans, regardless of whether they lived in a synchronized way with nature or a more dissociated way with nature later on in later pagan phases, they did not really differentiate between different sort of dimensions of our existence. They did not understand the concept of the soul because they didn't see their consciousness as separated from the body. And herein lies the problem, basically. The problem, and let's even say this. Let me try and find the words that will not sound too harsh. I'll try again. The pagans saw their body not as a vessel to consciousness, but something that is in unison. They did not separate the two. Kad pitate šta hoće srce, šta hoće mozak, to su metafore. To su metafore koje su proizašle iz tog rascepa, iz te disocijacije koja nam se javila u kasnijem paganskom periodu. Ali u tim nekim osnovnim mitovima su the first, let's say, matriarchal myths of synchronization. The person exists in its totality. There is no difference between your mind and your body. The soul does not even feature as a concept. It does not exist for a Stone Age person. A Stone Age person might believe, or might hope rather, because, znate, svako verovanje na neki način nada, je li tako? Vidiš, najslađe mi je kad neki hrišćanin kaže, pa šta me košta da ispoštujem i da verujem, možda je tačno. Pa znači, onda ne veruješ da je tačno. Ako je možda. Mislim, ali to je skroz okej, to je ljudski, ali tako je, svi se bojimo jedne stvari, a to je smrt, koja nam dolazi u svakom slučaju, bojali se mi toga ili ne. I bilo bi lepo da ima nečeg posle, a možda i ne bi bilo lepo, mi ne znamo šta može da se desi posle. Znači, to su jako neke kompleksne stvari. But the point is, early pagans believed only in the unity of a person. And so they might have believed that upon, death, they would be, united with the Mother Earth and reborn. And then later on, they believed that they could be sort of resurrected through fame, through sort of recordings of their life. But they never thought that soul and body, are two different things. They never saw their consciousness as separated from the body. And then comes Christianity. Now, why was it so easy for this sect, for this sort of set of beliefs to become so famous, so popular, and so widely accepted? Because imagine the times when Christianity was becoming, a more powerful sect. When I say more powerful sect, I mean more and more people started following Christ. And I don't even mean the actual Christ, but the idea of Christ. Znači, ne znam da li je to potrebno da nekako odvojeno objasnim. Morate da budete svesni. Znate koliko je bilo Vizantijsko carstvo? Ogromno. I sad pritom, imamo Hrista, so Christ supposedly lived in Jerusalem. That's the Middle East. And we are talking here about the center of Christianity being Rome 300 years later. Do you guys understand how weird that all is? And how inaccurate the stories that they both have, that have circulated around these countries might have been. Jel vam ulazi u glavu uopšte ta distanca? Znate, nije isto kad sad neko živi u Izraelu, pa sad ajde kao nek nam priču neku priču, pa mi sad svi postanemo njegovi followeri, svi pratimo Gal Gadot, koja je Izraelka, na Instagramu i verujemo u nju, jer je gledamo svakog dana. Mislim, sad, da se stvori neki novi mesija, to bi mi bilo čak i lako da poverujem zašto neko nekog prati. A možda zamislite tada, dolaze vam priče iz dalekih krajeva, egzotične priče. Sve je egzotika u neku ruku kad pogledate. Da li su Evropljani zaista znali ko je bio Hrist? Da li su imali ideju uopšte o tome ko je bio Hrist?
Oni su samo čuli priče.
Pa,
Tako da, samo od toga.
Praktično. Ako je pisao te priče, pisali su opet neki drugi ljudi. Samo sekund, izvinite, molim vas, nešto mi ovde zvoni, prosto ne znam šta je. Da slonim. Tako da, hoću da negde imate, at the back of your minds, the awareness that stories are very powerful, even stories that we receive today, stories that we receive with certain pictures, photos, that we cannot possibly believe, that may only have a grain of truth in them. And now imagine 2,000 years earlier, how accurate their stories might have been. The story of resurrection. Si ste vi nekada u životu videli, vi ste mladi, imate po 18 godina, 19, da li ste ikada videli da neka mačka, pas ili osoba vaskrsne? Ova ćutnja možda bude i da i ne. Jeste li nekad videli vaskrsnu?
No, not really.
Ne znam. Zato što to su suštini, evo, kažete Teodora?
Pa kao ono za vampire, histerija.
Tako. I pritom imamo i razne druge histerije kako kažem, u istoriji čovečanstva imamo i razne druge histerije. Vampiri su mnogo interesantna ideja, jer je ideja zapravo došla iz folklora i to srpskog, ne znam da li ste to znali, mi smo stvorili vampire.
Imamo video na YouTube-u, jedan Amerikanac, mislim Srbin koji živi u Americi, je napravio TED video o Drakuli, kako je nastao Drakula i pominje Srbiju da je...
A dobro, bre, Teodora, nije vam trebao nikakav Amerikanac da vam priča o tome što ste radili na gotičnim studijama i ovoga ste radili Brava Stokera.
Mislim da sam došla do toga, ali znam da i znam i od ranije.
Dobro, da.
Htjela sam mene video.
Da, hvala. Dimitri, kažete?
I just wanted to say that it's not really about Dracula, and I don't think that the first ever vampire, not including Sava Savanovic, the first origin of the vampires and where the word came from, I don't think that the first ever vampire was kind of named. It's just a story from a small village.
Yeah, regardless of whether it had a name, it had meaning. Ste vi svesni koliko je značenje i metafore, koliko su zapravo moćne? Mislim, jezik jeste moćan, nije uopšte čudo što su službe u crkvama bile na latinskom i dugo posle toga da su se Biblije prevele na takozvani kolokvijalni jezik, vernacular language, colloquial. Zašto su bile na latinskom? Because there's a mystery to what you don't understand. There's a mystery to what comes to you in a form that is illegible to you, to unknowable to you even. So there's that problem. But anyway, there was no separation between the body and the soul before this philosophy of Christianity. But at the same time, we cannot really claim that this philosophy was actually the philosophy of Christ. First of all, there are two such contrasting accounts within the Bible itself. Kad kažem Biblija, when I refer to the Bible, I do always mean the both testaments, the Old Testament and the New. So there's a crucial sort of essential difference between the attitude in the two testaments. I mean, I warmly invite you to read the two testaments and to sort of get the feel, get the idea of whether these two traditions can belong to one and the same tradition. Mislim, kako možete, mislim, znate, sad neću da dužim ovu priču uopšte o hrišćanstvu, pošto nam to nije u suštini tema ovog časa. Mislim, ne samo hrišćanstvo, nije već širenje hrišćanstva na...
I'm sorry, but what exactly is the topic? I got lost for a second.
The topic is Christianity, but as I started saying, it's how Christianity spread on the British Isles. But what I mean to say is I don't want to go into the details of how different the two testaments are, because that would be a much longer discussion. That was my point, basically. But so I don't want to go into those details, but obviously we will be talking about Christianity on the British Isles. So anyway, so you can imagine, as you talked to Maria, what was it, on Tuesday, and she sort of made a very nice distinction between the waves of Christianization. We had the Romans come to the British Isles and sort of, let's say, enslave the Celts and sort of blend their cultural mix and religious mix with the Celtic practices. And more or less, the situation on the Isles was such until for, let's say, year 400, the very beginning of the 5th century, so some odd years after the 400s. But Christianity had already existed by that time, right? And as we talked last week with Maria, what basically happened is the first forms of Christianity were very slowly spreading, let's say, from 1 AD, for lack of a better reference, from the 1st century after Christ. They were slowly spreading throughout the world. And of course, westwards and northwestwards as well, meaning reaching the British Isles with the Romans. But the first forms of Christianity that actually came to the British Isles were not the dogmatic versions of Christianity that we know about today. This is why I asked you about dogmas. So the first versions of Christianity were in fact ideas and philosophies and practices that were built or sort of added, that supplemented some previous beliefs of other people. Earlier, I mentioned these dogmas. You know what they are. Can you imagine imposing a dogma on a pagan tribe? Would that be something that would be easy to do? To impose a dogma or a set of something completely different to a people, to a community that has their own practices?
Of course not.
Not really, yeah.
Why not?
They have their own beliefs, so why would they take another one that they don't know anything about?
Exactly, especially if those beliefs work, right?
Yes.
But have you reached the ecclesiastical history of the English people with Professor Daniela? Have you read the parable of the sparrow and the baptism of was it Edwin in the 9th century?
Only parable.
Yes.
Sorry, only the parable.
Yeah.
Okay. So imagine this. Imagine these circumstances. As a Celt on the British Isles, you're basically at the mercy of the Romans. You pay some taxes. You might be saved from the raids of the Anglo-Saxons. You might not. Who knows? But life is basically war. Life is struggle. Life is trying to survive. And then the Romans leave. In the meantime, the entire of Europe and the Middle East is in, different sort of uprising, in turmoil, political, military. There's wars everywhere. And on top of that, around the end of the 4th century, basically, you have Anglo-Saxon tribes, Germanic tribes, basically constantly raiding the British Isles. What do you have of your own life? Is there anything that, that you can salvage in that sort of context? Can you salvage anything material? Jel razumete pitanje uopšte? Znači, zamislite, cela Evropa, mislim ne cela Evropa, sam ceo svet praktično u tom periodu, je bio pod konstantnim ratovima, pod konstantnim konfliktima. Vi, ako hoćete da se bavite mirno poljoprivredom, to teško da može da vam bude karijera životna, jer neko će doći i ako slučajno imate nekakav višak žita u svojoj kućici, šta će se desiti? Ukrašće vam, a vas će ubiti, na primer. Vremena su bila prilično problematična. Kažete, Luka?
Well, yeah, they couldn't tie themselves to anything material because their lives were very short and hectic, and they would die early. Their children would often die from disease, from
anything, really. If you're not killed by someone, you will die from a disease. I mean, the lifespan was what, 30 years old, and you were lucky if you got to 40. You were an old person.
they were only basically quote unquote allowed to live in the moment and survive day to day.
Well,
which is why something that was so tied to like the I suppose tied to the spirit and the separation between the spirit and the carnal and the body was part of the same.
I sad taj duh je mnogo isto problematičan koncept u hrišćanstvu iz prostog razloga što do dana današnjeg crkva nijedna nije definisala šta je Sveti Duh. I ne zna se da li je Sveti Duh Hrist ili je Bog ili šta je i nije spola koje spaja Hrista i Boga i tako dalje. But yeah, let's just use body and soul because we're the safest there. Zato što
body and soul, yes.
Da, to je ono Lena što malo prepitala šta je uopšte tema ovog predavanja. Tema je sve, Lena, kao što će uvijek biti tema sve, ali terminološki postavke, zato što ako kažemo spirit, pogrešili smo. Yes, spirit and soul are not the same thing.
Da, pomešao sam na to.
Ne kažem Luka vama, nego prosto ponavljam da bi svi ko nije uhvatio malo pre da može prosto da razume. So there's that. So the British Isles, even though they're isles, even though they're in a way separated from Europe, they were part of this entire process. So basically what we have, and I will share this presentation with you just so that we get to have, I think, a bit more of a structure to this class. Do you guys see this? Moj prozor?
Yes.
Yeah? Cool. So basically, how Christianity started spreading is that the center of Christianity, as we knew it by then, which had become Rome, so Italy, the Roman Empire, Italy today, but the Roman Empire, started sending their own missionaries to basically spread Christianity. Now that was a very, let's say, dangerous job. And you know that this also happened when a lot later, like 1,000 years later, when Portugal, Spain, France, and England sent their own missionaries to Americas, not just North America, but also South America, to sort of Christianize the tribes there. It was both a dangerous task, but also very lucrative. And this is also something I want you guys to think about. Oh, sorry, the position, or rather not the position, the connection between the state, the church, and the people. Yes, Ilija.
Htio sam samo da pitam, pošto smo se dotakli mnogo različitih tema i išli iz krajnosti u krajnost, šta će, ako možete malo konkretnije od ovoga da bude na kolokviju?
A kako to vi vidite da ja idem iz krajnosti u krajnost? Hoćete mi objasnite, molim vas.
Pa zato što smo se dotakli mnogo različitih tema, od vampira preko religije.
Vi ste to uhvatili, a vampire ste uhvatili kao temu u kojoj pričamo danas.
Ne, nego deo stvari koje smo pričali, pošto je bilo široki opseg tema koje će konkretnije stvari da budu na kolokviju. Samo je to bilo.
Na kolokviju me mi pitate?
Da.
Biće sve ono što vam je u knjizi. Do strane koju budemo obradili, koju vam budem rekla. Ne znam, Ilija, šta da vam kažem, ukoliko mi je dosadno, ukoliko mislite da vam je ovo nebitno, ukoliko vi već imate osnove o svim, kako da kažem, terminološke osnove i osnove o konceptima i fenomenima, da možete da govorite prosto sa sigurnošću o tome, možda vam je prosto, možda nisu predavanja potrebna. Ja zaista ne znam.
Ne, naravno da ne, nego samo me zanimalo, pošto je veliki opseg tema, šta će sve da bude, ništa više.
Za takva pitanja u suštini, Ilija, sačekate kraj predavanja, a ne prekidate u sred predavanja.
U redu, izvinite.
Saslušate prosto do kraja, pa vidite gde smo došli. Kažete, Zorana?
Mislim da je samo htjela da kaže da ponekada mnogo skrećemo sa teme i onda možemo da zaboravimo suštinu o tome, o stvari o čemu pričamo, i onda zaboravimo na šta smo u stvari trebali da pričamo, što može nekada nam skrene pažnju. U tom smislu je verovatno možda pričao.
Dobro. Ali celog dana, u stvari danas pričat ćemo o hrišćanstvu i o širenju hrišćanstva. A mislim da ono što smo prešli malo pre, o tome kako razne priče zapravo dovode do različitih shvatanja nečega, Mislim da mi je to kao lekcija jako bitno i kad je u pitanju i digitalna pismenost sa kojom danas imamo problema. Kad čitate razne vesti na internetu, pa ne znate prosto šta je tačno, pa verujemo u ivermektin i verujemo u tome da su vakcine otrovi i tako dalje. Prosto to jesu neke bitne stvari koje vi u suštini u životu morate da usvojite. Ako vi ne vidite povezanost, ne mislim na vas Zorana ili na vas Ilija, nego generalno kao, kažem, as a class, ako ne vidite povezanost među toga kako se šire priče, kako nešto što je fikcija postaje realnost, to je prosto problem. Mislim, i morate da probate da razmišljate na taj malo širi način da biste ovo shvatili. Ono što ću ja probati danas da vam prosto objasnim je kako se to hrišćanstvo širilo i dobijate uvod o tome, a ono što je u knjizi, ja sam vam 100 puta rekla, a upravo o tome vam i pričam, iako možda drugim rečima, ja stvarno ne mogu da vam reprodukujem knjige, to možete i sami da radite sebi, da ih čitate i da ih prepričavate sami sebi. Na ovim časovima bi trebalo da razmislite o nekim stvarima. Fenomenološki posmatramo neke sociokulturološke fenomene. Ne znam kako drugačije to da vam objasnim. A mogu i naravno da vam izdeklamujem lekciju, ali bi vam to bilo lakše. Da ne morate razmišljati uopšte. Ok, nadam se da sam odgovorila na neke od vaših komentara i pitanja. In any case, so the first forms of Christianity that arrived perhaps sometime before the Romans had to leave the British Isles must have been only the washed away or, very mild versions of what we will today call Christianity. In fact, it took certain time for Christianity in itself to establish a very clear form. Now, you guys mentioned that last week. Christianity became the official religion in 325, when it was declared by Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, as the official religion. Does that mean that it was sort of in the dogma, in the sense of its dogma, that it was a finished product? Not really. Not in Rome, not in other parts of the world, and definitely not on the British Isles. So 325 AD was the year it became official. But still, at that very moment, it had very different versions or very different traditions that were included in the local version of it. So here you see that I say here basically what I mentioned earlier, so I'm going to go further. This is why I went back basically to explain to you this differentiation between body and soul that came much, much later, because nature, when we say nature, we mean basically our perception of our surroundings, started to be so dangerous and so cruel to us that as humans, in those communities, they had to come up with something basically to make them feel more secure. And once you deify and demonize nature, meaning once you give nature, and nature already had, in a way, some sort of divine position, but once it was demonized, then they had nothing to turn to. Jel razumete to što hoću da kažem? Znači, ono što su ranije verovali pagani, koji su verovali u mitove sinhronizacije, u veliku boginju, majku koju ih čuva i tako dalje, jako je ona imala 3 aspekta, so even though she had 3 aspects, one of which was not very benevolent, now became demonized completely. So nature became the home of monsters. You will see that in Beowulf, for example. Nature became that very parable of the sparrow. Ako se dobro sećamo uvoda, well, it's not the introduction, so it's the discussion between the king, his priest or his shaman, basically, his druid, and the missionary who comes to Christianize this kingdom, probably Wessex, Edwin probably, or Egbert. So in any case, this missionary says, this life of man, O king, and then to paraphrase, is like the flight of a sparrow. So they lived in those times in a great darkness. Okay, so the only thing that provided some sort of security was their belief in a certain deity. But by that time, their sort of deities, their gods, their pantheon of the things that they believed in, didn't really bring them any results. There was so much death, there was war, there was conflict. So what they had the need for was something different, was probably something that would bring them some sort of peace and comfort. And we tend to also think about these people living, let's say, before Christ or around that time, let's say that the early medieval period, as primitive, but they were really not. They were not technologically advanced. They had so many more fears than us today, which would make them probably ridiculous from our perspective. But in fact, that is the crux of the matter. They believed in very many different things that we would today find ridiculous because of those fears. So last week, I think Theodora asked the question about Paul and Peter. They are mentioned in this book, in the course book, as the first disciples of Christ, just to give you a timeline of when the missionary sort of campaigns began. Znači, opet se vraćamo na taj timeline zato što hoću da razumete kako je teklo to pokršćavanje, konverzija u hrišćanstvo u svakom slučaju. Znači, the first advocates, Paul and Peter, were executed by the Romans in 67 AD. Koliko su oni bili stari onda, ako su uspeli i da upoznaju Hrista i da mu budu prijatelji, a da onda i nastradaju, bar 67 godina kasnije. Zato vam pričam o fikciji, Ilija. Zato vam pričam o tome da razmišljate o načinu na koji se šire razne priče i kako se oblikuju i kako se stvaraju. In any case, as probably mentioned last week, the original doctrine is considered to be love transcends death. Now, what does that mean? Have you ever heard of the word agape?
Yes.
I will write it down here in the chat box. Agape. Agape is the so-called charitable love. And that's what transcends death, basically. Love transcends death. Agape is in love towards everything and everyone transcends death. In a way, when we speak about this as the first doctrine of Christianity and the first teachings of Christ, we cannot be sure that that is really true. We really don't have any recorded evidence or historical evidence to even claim that. But during that time, it is no wonder that such philosophies started spreading, whether by Christ or by people like Christ, gurus even, if you will, in the East. There were ideas about a different sort of community, a community that is not plagued by war, by greed, by objectifying people, by slavery, etc. And now, of course, when this idea reached the British Isles, when the Romans finally left, or rather, when Christianity became the official religion and then the Romans left, it couldn't just be, it couldn't just replace the already existing Celtic folklore, let's say, or sets of beliefs, their own pagan beliefs. But it created something that is particularly interesting and something that was called the Welsh Christianity. And it's only one of the many versions of Christianity that existed on the British Isles. Now, you know how in popular culture, usually paganism is represented as women in white sort of dancing around and a lot of food offered and things like that. Well, in a way, even Welsh Christianity was, preserved that pagan folklore in a sense. With this idea, with this teaching of Christ that love transcends death and love transcends all, basically, they just incorporated this doctrine and this idea, philosophy, into their own communal practices, and that created basically this Welsh Christianity. So Celtic folklore, tribal culture, and these early teachings of Christ. And this is where monasteries began, cultural and religious centers, and I think you guys already mentioned that. Sad, Zorana i Ilija, evo zašto sam vam davala ovoliki istorijski pregled i ovoliki uvod. But then, around the 5th century AD, so 5 centuries after Christ, after these original teachings that we find from certain records here and there, historical records, I mean, there is the so-called Pelagius versus Saint Augustine controversy. Now, Saint Augustine was this very important and very controversial character, and you should definitely Google him and find a reliable study to read about him. He was a very, very interesting character. He used to live in Africa, in today's Egypt, or whereabouts. He had a harem of women. He was, in a way, involved with religious teachings, but not necessarily just Christian, but any. He was a literate man, definitely, so a knowledgeable man as well. He was also known to be a womanizer, not just because he had so many wives, but just because of his sort of humanely appetites. And then he gets a job in Rome. Bukvalno je tako bilo, dobio posao, unajmili su ga u stvari, zato što je bio jako rečit i imao jako zanimljive ideje. Propagandista, tako reći, jedan od prvih propagandista. So he was called to Rome to actually aid in the first attempts to systematize, in a way, the sets of religious beliefs. Now, what happened? Zato sam ovo malo prepričala. In the beginning, with the spreading of Christianity, first of all, they didn't know what Christianity was exactly. The philosophy was evolving. Every different missionary sends a slightly different message. That man believed that something was important. The other man believed that something else was important. So at one point, the center of Christianity in the world, which is Rome, it has been forever, basically, sort of decided that they needed some sort of systematic approach. They needed someone to make it all look, sane, to gather these ideas that they wanted to put across to people and make it a thing. And that was basically Saint Augustine's job. So Saint Augustine was the man who, in fact, started and wrote the doctrine of the original sin. And this doctrine of the original sin is one of the most important, tenets of Christianity, that we are all born sinful. And with being born sinful, you need to be baptized, because water at the baptism actually cleanses you from your sins, etc. Zašto toliko idemo u digresije? Zato što dan danas mi imamo, recimo, na filmovima slike gde Sveti Jovan Krstitelj krsti nekog, jel tako? To je, recimo, negde oko Hristovog rođenja, a doktrina je nastala 5 vekova kasnije. Dakle, doktrina originalnog greha, prvobitnog greha, nikada nije bila deo hrišćanstva u vreme kada je Isus Hrist živeo, već je postala to mnogo, mnogo kasnije. So, the doctrine of original sin was then proposed by St. Augustine. It was strongly supported by the Roman Church, and the missionaries from the 5th century on were basically asked to spread this doctrine. Now, what are the implications of this? The implications of this are that basically by telling people that they are corrupt from the very moment they're born, they're basically going to hell. So in one way or another, they need to spend their entire lives being better in the manner in which the church tells them in order to get to heaven. Because otherwise you go to hell, and hell is not a place for these medieval people that we think. No, it's a place of flames, fire, devils, demons, who knows what monsters. We don't even believe these things anymore. I mean, can you really scare anyone by telling them to go to hell or that they would burn in hell? more or less, but I don't think so. Well, back then you really could, because they had so much more that they didn't really know about. So that was St. Augustine, an awesome guy. He actually got canonized and sanctified, and he became a saint in Rome. And of course, you have to always find it ironic that he was a man who had so many wives, and he actually wrote the doctrine of the original sin. And you gotta love it. Pelagius, on the other hand, was a missionary also coming from Rome, but a missionary who believed in the opposite. He actually believed in the so-called purity and perfectibility of the human soul. Now, what does that mean? For him, man had his own will. Man was not corrupt at birth. And the only thing that you actually needed was this sort of stoic acceptance that life is full of good and bad, but that by your own choice, you can actually be a better person, and that you didn't really need the church to help you do that. And that was the crucial sort of, well, one of two or three bone of discontent, of war, basically, between Pelagius and St. Augustine. Pelagius was actually executed by Rome, not by personally St. Augustine, but by Rome, because of what he preached. And ironically, and you can already see that probably, Pelagius's preaching was closer to what we call the early teachings of Christ. It was more similar to these early teachings of Christ than St. Augustine's or Rome's version of Christianity. But of course, with Pelagius being executed by Rome, there wasn't really any doubt about what kind of Christianity will be spread further on. Of course, as you can see on the slide, so around the 5th century, again, around this time of this controversy, in 432 AD in Ireland, there is this one of the appearances of St. Patrick and his miracles. Of course, he wasn't St. Patrick. At the time, he was probably just a Patrick, a man who supposedly worked miracles. I don't know if Maria planned to tell you anything about St. Patrick, but maybe tomorrow, if she has the time, she will. So in any case, St. Patrick is also, in a way, a representative of Irish Christianity as a very resilient form of culture and religion that has to this day kept traces of its own paganism. Jeste primetili nekad kako St. Patrick je uvek zelen? Jeste čuli nekad uopšte za Sveta Patrika?
Da.
So he always wears this green sort of dress. He always has a staff, štab ko Gandalf. He is followed by, wood animals, etc. He, in a way, belongs to nature. He's not very far removed from it. And as it has here, patriarchal Christian principle fused with pagan worship of nature, and therefore the color green. And for a while, the center of Christianity is no longer Rome, but in the sense on the British Isles. In fact, on the British Isles, we had separate centers of Christianity, and it was Irish Christianity based in Iona. But that's around the 6th century only. And then a century after, it was in Lindisfarne, a sort of a version that is called the Scottish Christianity. But you notice, Welsh Christianity, Irish Christianity, Scottish Christianity. Basically, we just call it that because now you can sort of guess where these communities were geographically located. But just go back to the Celtic times, and you realize, whichever the differences in their Celtic beliefs, the Christian ideas merely fused with them later on. So there wasn't any extreme difference between the two. And in fact, what you need to remember from this presentation, or from this lecture in any case, is that Lindisfarne and Iona were for centuries throughout the Middle Ages, since their foundations to 6th and 7th century. Znači, nikad ne želim da pamtite ove godine tipa 563. Sveti Kolumba ili Ajdan 634. Znači, to je apsolutno nepotrebno da vi sad to pamtite i da znate to na pamet. Ok mi je da znate koji misionar je došao gde, ako vam je to isto bitno, ali ono što mi je najbitnije da znate je da su postojala ta dva manastira, koji su to manastiri bili i koja je razlika između hrišćanstva koje se tu propovedalo i hrišćanstva koje ćemo videti da se kasnije i tekako propagira kroz centar koji je u Rimu, odnosno na britanskim ostrvima kroz Canterbury. So there is this difference. And ultimately, with the two sources of Christianity, one being Rome, as in Catholicism in the future, and the other being these sort of Celtic versions of Christianity. And when we see the St. Pelagius and St. Augustine controversy, you can also see the roots of what are going to be religious conflicts on the British Isles as well. Da li ste nekada čuli za neke uopšte religijske konflikte na britanskim ostrvima? Odnosno u Engleskoj.
Da, između protestanata i katolika.
Na primer. A zašto su to tolike razlike? Šta vi mislite? Mislim, ne pitam vas, Luka, pitam vas sve. Da postoje neke drastične razlike između njih? Marko i Teodora, slobodno.
Pa, katolicizam tvrdi da mora da postoji veza između crkve i čoveka da bi mogao čovek da se poveže sa Bogom, a u protestantizmu se tvrdi da čovek može sam da se poveže sa Bogom, da ne treba crkva da bi se povezao.
U suštini, da. Da. A evo, Teodora zna, ajde vama onako spoiler alert, a sve se to desilo samo zato što jedan kralj nije mogao da se razvede po katoličkoj crkvi. I onda je rešio da napravi svoju crkvu i da može da radi šta god hoće. I danas, ljudi koji su protestanti, mislim danas možda ne toliko od pre 100 godina, definitivno i pre 50, kamo pre 100 i više, ljudi se ubijaju međusobno zbog toga što su različite religije, a u stvari i nisu, a u stvari pitanje je šta to sve uopšte znači biti iste ili različite religije. Why is this important? The important part of all of this is the manner in which Christianity actually reached let's say, the larger communities on the British Isles. So now we are already talking about, let's say, 5th and 6th century. By this time, we definitely know that the British Isles were populated by the newcomers, the newly arrived, let's say, Anglo-Saxon tribes, the tribe that actually drove the Romans out and drove the Celts to the fringes of the British Isles. Now, what did these Anglo-Saxon tribes do? In fact, what they did was they established smaller kingdoms. These kingdoms were at least 7 at one point. So, and you probably have heard of all these names: Northumbria, Essex, Wessex, Sussex, I don't know, a lot of others. And basically, these sort of kingdoms, because we don't have a better word for that, but they were not really kingdoms. They functioned on the basis of tribal organization. To razumete, li tako? Kao praktično funkcionisale su kraljevstva kao plemenske zajednice. And this is not, terminologically, it actually works to say that, because there were not as many people as we would imagine. In fact, the population was very small. And I don't know if you guys watched the TV show called The Vikings.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else?
2 seasons only.
Yes.
Yeah, at least the first season. I think the first season is important for this. This is by no means sort of an invitation for anyone to learn anything from TV shows, because that's always a tricky business and it's usually impossible to do so. But this TV show, The Vikings, at least at one point, gives a very good rendition and a very good interpretation of how these kingdoms functioned, and I mean the kingdoms on the British Isles, and also how religion spread in the British Isles. Now, Teodora, last week, during your appreciation classes, you mentioned something of wives of kings accepting religion. It really wasn't like that. First of all, women, up until the 18th century, had no word, had no important significance or any weight in any political and larger social matters. So it really wasn't about any female participants. Well, the thing was, obviously, when the missionaries would come into a certain community, they wouldn't necessarily immediately talk to the king or the counselors of the king's advisors. No, they would spread their philosophy, their word, basically their stories among the people. And that's how you get the majority of people to actually start thinking or even talking about this new, for example, idea about something. Ima vam to i delo je logično, zar ne? Si nećete odmah da idete kod predsjednika države, nego ćete narodu da pustite neku priču i onda narod kad već doživi tu onu kritičnu neku masu, u smislu da većina govori o nečemu, onda to dođe do kralja i onda kao, aha, možda bi trebalo ovo da razmotrimo. So basically, these missionaries were coming to one kingdom, the other, and it was only in the 8th and the 9th century that the first actual sort of kingdom conversions happened. Znači, i u to vreme vi ste imali hrišćane na Britanskim ostrvima, recimo i u 7., i u 6., 7., 8., 9. veku. Ali the connection between the official religion and the actual religions practiced in the, let's say, the kingdom was in the 9th century. And this is somewhat important and somewhat interesting because at that point in time, in the medieval period, religion was not just something that we find to be our personal preference or something that we subjectively may enjoy or not, or, believe or not. That was, in a way, a lifestyle. Religion was extremely important because of the bonding of the group as well, because of the social cohesion, znači društvena povezanost. Nije isto sada biti nemam pojma, ateista dok su svi hrišćani, jer niko neće ništa da mi uradi zbog toga. Ali u srednjem veku, kad ste vi pagan, a svi ostali su hrišćani ili obrnuto, to je moglo da bude prilično opasno. Jel me pratite?
Yes. Yeah. It was basically mandatory because if they didn't practice it, they would become social outcasts and could be therefore treated differently or even have a harmful fate.
Exactly. Which, additionally, is extremely ironic, isn't it? Because love transcends death. And boom, you have Inquisition. Boom, you have ostracism if you're not a Christian. Boom, you have this if you're not a Christian.
Well, at that time, they weren't really governed by logic, per se. So that wasn't really an important aspect to them.
What, logic?
Well, the way that you said it now is the rationalization of it, and just from the point of view that you basically assessed it, it isn't logical, but to them, that wasn't really a big deal. They didn't really care for that aspect.
I know, but just, I'm just telling you about the hypocrisy of values.
Yes, I agree.
But also, it's not for them. I mean, let's not da se ne odvajamo toliko od ranih hrišćana i srednjovekovnih hrišćana do, recimo, nas, do današnjeg dana. Mislim, vi znate da je džamija ovde gorela u Nišu pre 15-20 godina. Kao simbol, tad je već bilo, kad je bilo proglašenje Kosova, šta se desilo, odmah su zapalili džamiju ovde. Znate, uopšte da se ne pravimo da smo nešto civilizovaniji od ljudi u srednjem veku, kad realno nismo. Samo se izvinjavam za čas da isključim ovo. Sistem kaže preopterećenje puno ljudi. But yeah, Lena, I agree with you, but I just wanted to add that I think the condition of not critically assessing what you sort of believe in or preach, etc., is chronic and it's persisted to this very day. But to go back to the story, because Ilija and Zorana are going to kill me if I don't. Why am I telling you, why am I mentioning you the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms or early English kingdoms, if you will? Because this is when religion, the church, in fact, because we can now safely talk about the church, because it's a very, by now, by the 8th and the 9th century, it is a well-established institution that has the center in Rome, that has also a very structured missionary, but very structured missionary campaigns. So to actually convert an entire kingdom into Christianity did not just mean that you are, spreading the love of Christ to a new kingdom. It meant that an entire kingdom becomes your religious ally. It becomes, in a way, a friend. Znate, svi smo hrišćani. U jednom trenutku imamo celo hrišćansko, englesku hrišćansku, imamo francusku hrišćansku, imamo Španiju hrišćansku, imamo Nemačku, ali Španci ostaju katolici, Francuzi takođe ostaju katolicima, da njima to nije bilo toliko bitno, a Englezi postaju protestanti. And then we have a huge issue, we have a problem. Because if you are a member of a certain group, what does that mean? Can you act independently of the group? It's almost a too simple a question, isn't it? Ako ste član jedne grupe, da li možete da radite šta vi hoćete, a da ne pitate grupu?
No, obviously.
Trebalo bi da ne. So basically the idea of sending missionaries and converting entire kingdoms or whatever they were at that time, wasn't, because of altruism. It wasn't just because people love people. It was because if you turn a kingdom into a Christian kingdom, you actually gain something. You gain an ally politically or in one way or another. And also, you remember what we talked about with those monasteries being raided and pillaged by the Vikings at one point, and by other tribes as well. You remember, I think we talked about that last week in our lectures, that monasteries were repositories of knowledge, but also repositories of gold, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this gold was also shared with Rome. Okay, so Rome wasn't really built in a day, that's true, and nor was Vatican. It took centuries. So I'm just repeating this because I think you should always be well aware of that. And I mean, this sort of unity between the church and the state becomes more and more important. What happens in, let's say, the 8th century? In the 8th century England, you had two very big kingdoms. I mean, before that time you had 7, and then you know what happens. One ruler dies, the next one is a bit of a weaker general, then the kingdom gets invaded by another kingdom, usually the neighboring one, and then one kingdom sort of merges into the other, etc. By the 8th century, the British Isles basically had Mercia as like this very powerful kingdom, a very, very powerful force, but not in terms of today, obviously, in terms of the Middle Ages. And you had Wessex. And you had this, we still don't have religion, by the way. We still don't have Christianity, although off of Mercia did start the tradition, and he did establish the connection between the church and the state, but not in the way that it will further be official. But off of Mercia was one of the, let's say, most interesting rulers of early English history, because he was the first one to express that he wants to unite all England. ja obožavam te izraze tipa to unite all England, because that actually meant that he wanted to conquer all of the kingdoms and be their ruler. And he almost succeeded in that, but when he was a good warrior, but he didn't really pay too much attention to the economy of the country and things like that. So he was actually at one point taken over by Wessex. And then we enter the 9th century of English history, and we get to one of the most important kings, and you guys are already reading something in your other class, in your medieval English literature class, because of this very king. Because had it not been for Alfred the Great, a man who actually became a Christian, and his entire kingdom as well, we would have never been able to read the history of the ecclesiastical history of the English people by Venerable Bede and the parable of the sparrow, etc., etc. In fact, this king was such a religious man that he invested everything in rebuilding monasteries, establishing schools for boys, etc., etc. And he actually also learned to read and write, and he supported the writings, the historical recordings of everything that was happening at the time, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, etc. So in a sense, you can notice how Christianity, in fact, had an immense influence on the culture of the people at that time. For one thing, because it also offered a written language. The Latin language was something that had a system. You could write in Latin, you could read in Latin. I mean, if you were literate, of course, if you were a monk or extremely rich, so you could pay for someone to teach you that. But it enabled the recording of history. Do you guys get how important that was at that point in time? Because other attempts would have been sort of spontaneous or random, but the church had a system. Monasteries had a system, and in that sense, it is no wonder that Christianity and the church itself was so influential and so beneficial in this aspect for the people. Jeste ispratili ovo što sam htjela da kažem?
Da.
Sigurno. Sljedećeg časa ćemo nastaviti ovo o ranim engleskim kraljevstvima i o Alfredu Velikom i o borbi sa Vikinzima i tako dalje. A ako imate nekih pitanja, slobodno me sad pitajte u vezi sa hrišćanstvom. Ovdje smo u suštini sve pokrili. Jedna od najvažnijih stvari koju treba da znate je upravo ta kontroverza između Pelagija i Svetog Avgustina, odnosno kako je u stvari ta kontroverza uopšte i nastala i zašto je ona bitna, a bitna izuzetno, jer ranije verzije hrišćanstva uopšte nisu bile, to je ranije verzije. Hrišćanstvo je postojalo 5 vekova, dok nije uvelo jednu od svojih najstrašnijih doktrina, a to je doktrina, recimo, prvobitnog greha, po kojoj smo svi grešni. A u stvari čin krštenja suštinski, inicijalno uopšte nije imao veze sa pranjem nekog prvobitnog greha, imao je s nečim drugim veze. Da, Luka, kažete.
Ništa, samo vidim da i drugi imaju pitanja, ako mogu samo na kraju da se nadovežemo sa početka časa, jer bih baš htio da...
Dobro, ako vam je bitno, može.
Čisto sa vama ovako, znam da ostali čak i znaju.
Teodora, kažete.
Htjela sam da pitam, da li imamo u biblioteci onu ogromnu knjigu Trevelyannovu Istorija Engleske?
Ima, 100% ima, a ne znam šta će vam doduša, ali ima.
Ne sad, nego pitam možda neko...
Imamo, a mislim čak da možete, Teodora, to da nađete i na Gen Libu.
Da, najbolji sajt na svet, ali tražila sam, nema.
Pa dobro, možda ima neko drugo izdanje, baš Trevelyanna da tražite, možda dobro ako volite, izvolite.
Možda bude zanimljivo nekad.
Može.
Hvala.
Sigurno, nema na čemu. Slobodno pitajte ako imate još nešto o ovome što smo danas radili. Ako ne, to je onda to za danas. Kažite sad, Luka, imate svojih 5 minuta.
Doviđenja.
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 Doviđenja svima.
Doviđenja.
Aha, Ksenija.
Doviđenja.
Doviđenja.
Doviđenja.